Now let me tell you the story about Mrs. Banks. This story just about breaks my heart, and I hope you get the feeling of it. Mrs. Banks came to see me years ago to have a trust set up. She knew she needed that for her estate because it was large enough it would otherwise have to go through probate. She was a widow. She wanted to leave everything to her daughter and her son. I drew up a trust for her and called several times to get her to come in and review it and sign it. We couldn't ever get her to respond. So after a while, I didn't know what else to do, so I just had my secretary try to keep in touch. But what I found out later was that sometime after I had Mrs. Banks' trust prepared, she was in an automobile accident, quite a serious accident. It demolished her Cadillac, and she was put in the hospital for several months. Well, while she was in the hospital, her neighbor, I'm going to call him Mr. Nosy, he was really a helpful neighbor. He wanted to help her with her taxes while she was still able, and she was a good friend, and so he was concerned that her bills weren't being paid. And so he went to the court and asked that he be appointed to be the conservator for her estate so he could pay the bills and make sure things were done. Well, the court accepted this petition. They named Mr. Nosy to be the conservator, and they appointed a bank to draw up a trust for Mrs. Banks so that her assets would be held in this trust and Mr. Nosy could take care of all the things that needed to be done. And so her home was transferred into the trust, and her bank accounts and her investments and all of those things were placed in the trust under the control of this local bank. After a while, Mrs. Banks recovered. She returned home. She found that her car, of course, had been demolished and towed away, but she also found that some of her jewelry was missing. Her furs had been put in storage somewhere, and she was no longer able to take care of her own estate. She talked to her neighbor, Mr. Nosy, and he told her what had happened, that everything would be in a trust for her benefit under the discretion of a local bank. Well, she wanted things to be returned to her control, so she came back to see me. And now this is the first that I had heard of this accident and of all the things that had occurred since then. And so Mrs. Banks said, well, Mr. Allen, can't I have all these things returned to my own control? And I said, yes, you can, but to do that, we'll have to set aside the court appointment of the conservator and get you named as the trustee of the trust and maybe redo the trust the way you wanted it originally. And so she rescheduled a court appearance so that she could get this conservatorship set aside and be put back into control of that. The court wanted her to go visit a doctor and make sure that she had recovered sufficiently to manage her own affairs. So she went to her doctor, and the doctor did a series of tests, which got her a little bit confused and flustered, and she didn't answer everything quite correctly. And so the doctor was unwilling to give her a letter saying that she had completely recovered. And so when she went back to court for the second hearing, because even though the judge could ask Mrs. Banks questions on the stand and see that she seemed to be in control of her own affairs, he was reluctant to grant her full control because the doctor had not given the letter saying that she had completely recovered. Well, this was a sad series because I told Mrs. Banks if we had only signed the trust that had already been prepared for her, it would have placed her daughter in control over her assets. Her daughter would have been the guardian and conservator and could have paid her bills without having to go to court, and everything would have been just as she had outlined in her original trust document. But because of the court interceding in all this, she was unable to complete that. So we weren't able to do anything at that time, and Mrs. Banks passed away in another 4 or 5 months. I think one of the reasons for her death was a broken heart and a broken spirit over not being able to have control over her own assets. What I hope that you learn by this story is that you shouldn't put these things off. You never know what's in store for you in the future. Get your life prepared so that you will be able to have things under your control or under the control of somebody that you would like to control it, rather than have it placed in the hands of a third party.